By the 1990s, Thomasville Furniture employed 7,000 workers across 11 North Carolina plants and sold $500 million worth of handmade furniture a year. The name meant solid wood, real craft, heirloom quality. Then the decisions began. A corporate acquisition that moved control out of the town, an offshore sourcing strategy that replaced Piedmont woodworkers with factories in China, 9 rounds of layoffs in 5 years, 3,000 jobs gone, a bankruptcy that left 19,000 retirees' pensions 55% funded. By 2014, the last 84 workers in Thomasville were let go, and the name that T.J. Finch had built from a $2,000 lumber debt in 1904 belonged to a brand licensing company in New York. The big chair still stands on Main Street. The factories behind it are dark. This is the story of how a lumberman in a small Carolina town built one of the most trusted names in American furniture, and how that name was separated from the work, the workers, and the town that gave it meaning. Not through a single catastrophe, but through a series of choices, each one reasonable, each one moving the craft a little further from the hands that knew it. The story begins, as so many American furniture stories do, with timber, a railroad, and a town that didn't yet know what it would become. In 1904, in the Piedmont country of central North Carolina, rolling hills thick with hardwood forest, cross-cut by rail lines that connected small towns to big markets, a group of local investors scraped together $10,000 and incorporated the Thomasville Chair Company. They had a small factory. They had hardwood forests within hauling distance. They had workers who'd grown up handling lumber, men who knew oak by its grain and cherry by its smell before anyone taught them the trade names. And they had a conviction, shared by dozens of similar operations scattered across the Carolina Piedmont, that the American appetite for wooden furniture would only grow. $10,000, that was the whole of it. From that sum, the factory produced 180 chairs a day. Not fine furniture, not heirloom pieces, but chairs. Simple, solid, honest chairs built from Piedmont hardwood and shipped out by rail to wherever in America somebody needed a place to sit. The town itself was small. A few thousand people clustered along the railroad, surrounded by farms and forest. Thomasville, North Carolina, sat in Davidson County, the heart of what would become the densest concentration of furniture manufacturing in the United States. Dozens of small factories dotted the Piedmont, each one drawing from the same ingredients: abundant timber, cheap labor, and rail access to northern and midwestern markets. Most of those factories would remain small, would make their chairs and tables and dressers, and never become more than regional names. Thomasville Chair Company might have been one of them. What changed was a man in a debt. Thomas Jefferson Finch was a lumberman, a timber farmer who, along with his brother D.F. Finch, had supplied the young chair company with the raw wood it needed. By 1907, the company owed the Finch brothers $2,000 in unpaid lumber bills. The brothers could have demanded the cash, could have taken the company to court and collected what they were owed. Instead, they took stock. They converted the debt into ownership. That decision, born not from industrial ambition but from debt collection, turned the Finch family into the controlling force behind Thomasville Chair Company. T.J. Finch became president, and what had begun as a way to protect a lumber invoice became, over the next century, one of the most recognized furniture brands in America. But there's a quiet irony buried in that origin. The early debt pulled the Finch family into the factory. The later debt, the kind measured not in lumber bills, but in hundreds of millions of dollars, the kind that arrives attached to corporate acquisitions and leveraged buyouts, would help pull the factory out of the town entirely. Both debts reshaped the company. The first one built it. The second one hollowed it. Before that reckoning, though, there was building to do. And the Finches built. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. Thomas Jefferson Finch was not a furniture man. He was a Piedmont operator, the kind of figure who populated small-town North Carolina commerce at the turn of the century and held it together through sheer presence. He farmed timber. He produced and sold lumber. He helped found a telephone company and 2 banks. He served as sheriff of Randolph County. He was, in short, a man embedded in the tissue of his local economy, and when the Thomasville Chair Company couldn't pay him what it owed, he didn't walk away. He walked in. His brother D.F. joined him in taking stock instead of cash, and together the Finches transformed themselves from creditors into owners. TJ became president and began reshaping the company not as a dreamer with a factory blueprint, but as a practical man who understood that if the business failed, he'd lose more than his lumber money. He'd lose his investment, his reputation, and his stake in a town that was only beginning to figure out what it could be. The first years were lean, but the numbers moved in the right direction. By 1908, just 4 years after incorporation, Thomasville Chair Company reported profits on sales of $91,522. That figure sounds modest now, but in rural North Carolina in 1908, it meant the company had survived its infancy. It meant the chairs were selling. It meant the railroad was carrying Thomasville products out of the Piedmont and into a broader American market that was growing as fast as the country could build houses to furnish. Then Finch did what every successful small manufacturer eventually does when success arrives and the money's flowing. He started buying. In 1909, Thomasville acquired Bard Lumber and Manufacturing, nearly doubling the company's assets in a single transaction. The Bard acquisition wasn't just about getting bigger. It brought machine shop capacity into the Thomasville system, the ability to build and repair its own equipment rather than depending on outside suppliers for every gear and belt and blade. 5 years later, in 1914, the acquisition of Kramer Furniture more than doubled the company's size again. Kramer brought additional wrapping and upholstery space, inventory warehousing, and one of the largest veneer plants in the South. Each purchase followed the same logic: vertical integration. Finch wasn't collecting furniture companies like trophies. He was assembling a production chain that could take a log from the forest and turn it into a finished piece of furniture without ever leaving the Thomasville system. The wood came from local forests. It was milled in Thomasville. It was shaped, joined, finished, wrapped, and shipped in Thomasville. Every step that stayed inside the company was a step where the profit stayed too, and where the quality could be watched, measured, and controlled by people who'd staked their names on it. By 1917, sales topped $1 million. For a company that had started with 10,000 just 13 years earlier, that number represented something more than growth. It represented proof that the Piedmont model worked. Local timber, local labor, local railroads, and a product built close enough to the raw material that the wood practically walked from the forest to the factory floor. The sensory reality of that early operation lived in the hands of the men who ran it. Fresh-cut oak drying in stacks outside the mill, the boards arranged with spacers between them so the Carolina air could pull the moisture out slowly, the way you dry wood if you care about it warping or checking. Pine boards sweating resin in the summer heat. The sharp chemical bite of shellac in the finishing rooms, strong enough to make your eyes water if you weren't used to it. Varnish drying tacky on chair seats lined up in rows, each one catching the light differently as the finish settled. Sawdust so thick in the air that workers could taste it by mid-morning. Could tell from the flavor alone whether the saws were cutting oak or cherry or walnut. And underneath everything, the sweet, clean smell of newly milled hardwood. The smell that meant the saws were turning and the factory was alive. T.J. Finch died in 1931, but by then the next generation was already in place. His son, T. Austin Finch, had been rising through the company for years and was ready to take the chair. And a relative named Doak Finch had established himself as the operational mind behind the factory floor. The man who thought not in terms of markets and ledgers, but in terms of machines, systems, and the physics of turning wood into furniture at speed and at scale. The Finch family had entered the furniture business to protect a $2,000 lumber debt. Within a generation, they'd built one of the largest wood furniture operations in the American South, vertically integrated, locally rooted, and growing faster than anyone in that first cramped factory could have imagined. The debt was long paid. What replaced it was something larger than any invoice: an enterprise, a workforce, and a town that was beginning to understand what it meant to be known for something. The shift that made Thomasville more than a chair company happened in 1925 when the factory hired its first in-house designers. Before that, Thomasville built what the market demanded: solid, functional chairs, produced at volume, sold at reasonable prices. The designers changed the question. Instead of asking what will sell, they began asking what should a Thomasville home look like. The difference sounds subtle, but it moved the company from manufacturing into taste-making, from filling orders to shaping expectations about what American furniture could be. 2 years later, in 1927, the company offered its first complete dining room furniture line: tables, chairs, sideboards, hutches, a matched set that allowed a customer to furnish an entire room from a single maker. It was the pivot that separated Thomasville from dozens of other small North Carolina chair factories that dotted the Piedmont. Those competitors kept making chairs. Thomasville started making rooms. T. Austin Finch, who became president that same year, understood something about aspiration that his father's generation had sensed but never fully pursued. The elder Finch had built a production system. The younger Finch would build a brand. And the difference between the two was the difference between selling furniture and selling a version of how life ought to look when everything's in its right place. Austin Finch made a decision during the Depression that later management at other companies would find almost incomprehensible. When manufacturers across the Carolinas were cutting wages, slashing prices, and cheapening their product to survive the worst economic disaster in American history, Thomasville moved up market. Finch pushed quality higher. He invested in better wood, finer finishing, more careful joinery. The logic was counterintuitive but correct. In a depression, the customers who still had money wanted to be absolutely certain they were spending it on something that would last. Thomasville gave them that assurance, not through advertising slogans, but through the weight and grain of the product itself. You could feel the difference. You could run your hand along a Thomasville tabletop and know you were touching something that somebody had cared about making. That Depression-era quality push would echo forward for decades. It established the expectation, among customers, among retailers, among the workers themselves, that Thomasville didn't cut corners. It was the company's first real promise to the American consumer, and for a long time the company kept it. Meanwhile, Doak Finch was solving a different problem on the factory floor. The plant still relied on production methods that hadn't changed much since the company's founding. Skilled hands doing careful work, but slowly and at a cost per unit that limited how far the company could grow. Doak studied a manufacturer of automatic nail machines, equipment originally designed for the shoe industry, and saw a principle that could cross over. The shoe machine drove nails at precise intervals with mechanical consistency. Doak adapted the concept for furniture production, replacing some of the slower hand-nailing processes with machine-driven speed that didn't sacrifice accuracy. It was the kind of adaptation that separates companies that grow from companies that plateau, borrowing intelligence from an unrelated industry and applying it to your own. In 1937, the company installed one of the first conveyor systems in the furniture industry, moving product through the plant on a continuous flow rather than in batches carried by hand from station to station. That conveyor was more than an efficiency upgrade. It was a statement about scale. A hand-carried operation is limited by how many workers you have and how far they can walk in a shift. A conveyor operation is limited only by how fast the machines at each station can work. Thomasville was building the infrastructure for an output level that its founders couldn't have pictured. Then the war arrived, and the factory proved its versatility in ways that had nothing to do with dining rooms. During World War II, 65% of Thomasville's production effort shifted to government orders. The factory that had been making cherry sideboards and oak dining tables began turning out Army double-deck bunk beds, wood bomb plugs, tent stakes, and spatulas, tens of thousands of items built to military specifications, shipped to bases and staging areas across the country and overseas. The workers adapted without complaint. The same hands that could shape a cabriole leg could machine a bomb plug to government tolerance. The same eye that judged a finish coat could inspect a bunk bed frame for structural soundness. Thomasville's wartime work moved the company's products from living rooms to battlefields, and the workforce handled the transition, because the underlying skill, the ability to shape wood precisely and quickly, was the same. The war years taught the company two things. First, that it could retool at speed, that its people and its machinery were more flexible than peacetime production suggested. Second, that there was an enormous civilian market waiting on the other side of the conflict. American soldiers were coming home by the millions. They were getting married. They were buying houses in suburbs that hadn't existed 4 years earlier, in developments where the concrete was still curing and the lawns hadn't come in yet. Every one of those houses needed furniture. Every young family needed a kitchen table, a bedroom set, a living room that looked like the life they'd been promised. Thomasville came out of the war with its workforce intact, its machinery sharpened by wartime demands, and a domestic market that was about to explode. The post-war showroom opened in 1958 as a four-story facility that dwarfed many competitors' entire operations. Floor after floor of staged rooms, showing what Thomasville could do for an American home. By the early 1950s, the company had partnered with B.F. Huntley Furniture and St. John's Table Company to offer complete room groupings through coordinated marketing. The partnerships let Thomasville present itself not as a manufacturer, but as a total solution, the single name a homeowner could trust to furnish an entire house with pieces that matched, that lasted, that said something about the people who chose them. The strategy worked because the product earned it. Every piece that left the factory carried the implied promise that it was built to be passed down, not replaced. Grandmother's dining table wasn't just furniture. It was evidence that someone, decades earlier, had chosen well. The company that T.J. Finch had entered to collect a lumber debt was now a national brand with an industrial base, a design philosophy, a retail strategy, and a market position that placed it among the most important names in American home furnishing. The chair company had become a furniture empire, and the empire was still growing. By the early 1990s, the Thomasville operation had grown to 11 plants and 7,000 employees, and the physical reality of that scale started the moment you turned onto the road that led to the factory. Cars filled the parking lot in waves as the shifts changed. Headlights in the pre-dawn dark, engines idling, thermoses of coffee on dashboards, the low murmur of country radio through cracked windows. Workers walked toward the plant in clusters, lunch pails in hand, boots on asphalt, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going because they'd been going there for years. Some of them were second-generation Thomasville workers. A few were third. The morning shift formed up like a congregation arriving for a service everyone knew by heart. A new hire arriving for the first time would smell the factory before fully seeing it. The warm, slightly sweet scent of fresh-cut cherry mixing with the sharper edge of oak dust, layered over the chemical presence of lacquer and finishing compounds that hung in the air like weather you walked through rather than watched. Underneath those top notes, the denser smells, hot glue from the assembly lines, the petroleum bite of machine lubricant, and the particular dry sweetness of kiln-dried hardwood that old-timers said they could still identify 30 years into retirement. The smell of the factory was the smell of a working life, and it followed you home in your clothes, your hair, the creases of your hands. The workflow moved like a river with tributaries. Rough lumber arrived at one end, oak, cherry, maple, walnut, graded, sorted, and fed into the system. Saws broke it into dimensions. Planers smoothed it. Shapers cut joints and profiles with a precision that married the mechanical and the handmade. What had been a raw board became a table leg, a drawer front, a chair rail, moving from station to station through a plant so large that the journey from rough lumber to finished product could cover more than a quarter-mile of floor space. Workers at each station added their piece of the process and passed the work forward, and the cumulative effect was transformation. Wood in one door, furniture out the other, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a week. Charles C.L. White Jr. spent 46 years at Thomasville, most of them as a designer and design manager, before retiring in 1981. White's career spanned the era when Thomasville's design identity solidified, when the company moved from producing competent furniture to producing furniture with a recognizable aesthetic signature that customers could identify across a showroom floor. A designer at Thomasville didn't just draw shapes on paper. He understood wood behavior, how cherry darkened with age, how oak resisted certain finishes, how walnut's grain rewarded a light hand and punished a heavy one. He understood finishing chemistry, production constraints, the tolerances of the machinery, and the particular preferences of the American homeowner who wanted quality she could see and feel without needing anyone to explain it to her. The case goods operation, dressers, armoires, nightstands, dining tables, ran through facilities that combined handcraft with industrial process in ways most customers never imagined. A single drawer passed through more than a dozen stations, cut, shaped, sanded, fitted with dovetail joints, tested for slide and clearance, finished, and inspected before it ever met the piece it belonged to. The dovetail joint itself was a signature, a visible declaration that the piece was built to interlock, not just glued or stapled together and hoped for the best. Customers who knew furniture looked for dovetails the way car buyers looked under the hood. If the joints were tight and the wood was real, the rest would follow. In the late 1960s, Thomasville built an environmental simulation package testing laboratory, a facility designed to subject finished packaged furniture to the stresses of shipping before it ever left the plant. Temperature swings, humidity shifts, vibration, compression, the lab reproduced what a truck ride from North Carolina to California would do to a boxed dining table. And if the packaging failed in the lab, it got redesigned before a single unit shipped. It was the kind of investment that customers never saw and never thought about, but always benefited from. The table arrived intact, not by luck, but because someone in a testing lab had already destroyed one on purpose to make sure the packaging could handle the journey. The finishing rooms had their own atmosphere entirely, a controlled environment where temperature and humidity were regulated with care, because lacquer and varnish don't behave the same way in July heat as they do in January cold. Workers in finishing wore respirators and moved with the deliberate precision of people handling chemicals that demanded respect. The smell in those rooms was intense, a cocktail of solvents, sealers, and topcoats that clung to clothing and hair long after the shift ended. Finishing workers' families could tell when they'd walked through the door before they even saw them. By the time the company reached its peak, the headquarters and showroom occupied a 5-story, 225,000 square foot building on East Main Street in Thomasville. That building wasn't just office space, it was a cathedral of product, room after room of fully staged furniture displays, each one designed to show customers not just what a Thomasville piece looked like on a sales floor, but what a Thomasville life could feel like in a home. You walked in and the room surrounded you, and for a moment you could believe that this was how it was all supposed to be. The table, the chairs, the sideboard, the light falling on finished wood. The compressor air hissed. The pneumatic tools chattered in their rhythms. The sandpaper gritted against wood in a sound so constant it became part of the silence. And through all of it, the coffee from the break room and the cigarettes in the parking lot and the low, steady hum of a factory that had been running so long that the idea of it stopping had never occurred to the people inside it. Thomasville wasn't a town that happened to have a furniture factory. It was a town that existed, in economic and civic terms, because the furniture factory existed. Take away the factory and the town didn't disappear. People were still there, houses still stood, the railroad still ran, but the version of itself it had built, the identity, the confidence, the reason young people stayed instead of leaving for Charlotte or Raleigh, that was inseparable from the work. By the early 1990s, Thomasville Furniture operated 11 plants and employed more than half the town's working population. 7,000 people, not counting the satellite jobs in trucking, lumber supply, hardware, packaging, maintenance, and all the small businesses that fed off a payroll that size. The diner where the morning shift stopped for biscuits and coffee before clocking in. The hardware store that supplied replacement parts for factory maintenance. The bank that held the mortgages on houses bought with Thomasville paychecks. The barber shop, the church, the Little League teams sponsored by the company name. All of it tied to the factory by threads so constant they were invisible until they broke. The big chair stood downtown, right there on Main Street, the town's most recognizable landmark, a monument to the industry that gave Thomasville its identity and its nickname. The first version had been built in 1922 from enough lumber to make 100 ordinary chairs, a piece of civic theater that said plainly, "This is what we do here." It was replaced later with a concrete and steel version that became permanent, too large to sit in but too symbolic to move. Thomasville called itself Chair City, and the name wasn't boosterism or tourism marketing, it was a job description for an entire town. Dave Ogren, who served as vice president of marketing for case goods and worked at Thomasville from 1969 to 1982, was part of the generation that saw the company at full stride. Ogren lived through the years when the brand was still growing, when each new gallery opening and each new product line felt like confirmation that the company's trajectory had no ceiling. He later helped preserve the company archives, sorting through decades of catalogs, employee picnic photos, newsletters, holiday party programs, and civic materials that documented not just a corporation, but a culture. During his working years, though, the idea that the company would someday need archiving would have seemed absurd. You don't archive something that's still alive. You live inside it and assume it'll outlast you. The sales numbers told the story of dominance. Revenue doubled between 1982 and 1988, reaching $360 million. By 1990, Thomasville had established more than 500 galleries, dedicated retail spaces, either freestanding or as stores within stores inside major furniture retailers, where the full Thomasville line could be displayed in the kind of controlled environment that did justice to the product. By the mid-1990s, employment held steady at 7,000, and total sales climbed to $526 million. Those numbers represented something unusual in the furniture industry, a manufacturer that had built its own retail infrastructure and controlled the customer experience from factory floor to showroom floor. Most furniture makers relied on independent dealers and hoped for favorable placement and a salesperson who understood the product. Thomasville controlled the presentation. The galleries were designed, staffed, and stocked to deliver a specific experience. The experience of walking into a room that felt like the home you wanted to have, furnished by the one name that could deliver the whole picture. The advertising pushed even further into territory most furniture companies wouldn't have dared enter. In 1989, Thomasville launched a television advertising campaign worth more than $10 million, an extraordinary sum for a furniture company in an industry that traditionally left advertising to retailers and trusted that the product would sell itself on the showroom floor. Thomasville wasn't trusting. It was spending. It wasn't just making furniture anymore. It was manufacturing desire at a national scale, putting the Thomasville name into living rooms across America through the television set before the furniture arrived through the front door. A 1994 campaign for the Country Inns and Backroads collection targeted upscale women interested in antiques, museum art, cooking, and gardening, a customer profile drawn not from census data, but from lifestyle aspiration. Thomasville understood that the woman choosing a dining table wasn't just buying wood and finish. She was buying a statement about taste, permanence, and the kind of home she intended to keep for decades. The table wasn't a purchase. It was a declaration. But the prestige carried a structural truth that wouldn't become visible until the crisis arrived. The broader North Carolina furniture industry had grown out of Piedmont timber, railroads, and low-wage, weakly unionized labor. The furniture towns were geographically dispersed, and local civic industrial elites had long resisted organizing efforts. The wages were good for the region. A Thomasville paycheck bought a house, a truck, a life in a town where people knew your name, but they weren't Detroit wages or Pittsburgh wages. There was no United Auto Workers or United Steel Workers standing between the workers and the decisions that ownership might someday make about where the work would be done. The golden age was real and the pride was earned, but the foundations rested on arrangements that could be changed more quickly than the people who depended on them realized. Ryan Tessau, John Sullivan, and Vicki Holder, all Thomasville retirees, would later spend weeks in 2013 sorting through boxes of company history in a room that felt more like a salvage operation than an archive project. They were volunteers, working with Ogren and others to catalog what a century of furniture making had produced beyond furniture. A culture, a community, a civic identity so deeply embedded that losing the company felt less like a layoff and more like losing a part of the town's body. They were trying to keep the memory from being discarded. That preservation work lay in the future. In the early 1990s, the only question that mattered was how much bigger Thomasville could get. The brand was strong, the galleries were full, the plants were running. The town sat inside its own work like a hand inside a glove, perfectly fitted, perfectly matched, and everyone assumed permanent. The peak came in the early 1990s, and if you wanted to capture it in a single frame, you could do worse than this. 11 plants running across Thomasville and the surrounding region, 7,000 employees on the payroll, 500 galleries bearing the name from coast to coast, and a television advertising budget that most furniture companies in America couldn't have imagined spending. Frederick Starr had taken over as president and CEO in 1982, and under his leadership, the company had doubled its sales in 6 years, from $180 million to $360 million by 1988. Starr was an expansion man. He believed in growth through acquisition, facility development, national brand building, and the disciplined extension of the Thomasville name into every room of the American house. The numbers validated the belief quarter after quarter. 526 million in sales by the mid-1990s. Every year, bigger than the last. Every annual report confirming what the galleries and the advertising and the product line already proved. That Thomasville was not just a furniture manufacturer, but a brand that belonged in the same conversation as the finest names in American home furnishing. And Starr, to his credit, understood what made the brand work. He understood that the name wasn't just a marketing asset, it was a trust. And the trust rested on the fact that the furniture was made by real people in a real place. In 1990, he told the Washington Post something that would echo across the decades, long after the factories went quiet. We really do not want to close plants. We've got great plants, great people. You can't get them back if you close them. Great plants, great people. You can't get them back. It was the truth. He was standing at the summit when he said it, looking out across an enterprise that still made its furniture in the town that bore its name, staffed by workers whose families had been making that furniture for generations. He could see, clearly, explicitly on the record, what the loss of that connection would mean. He said it out loud in a national newspaper, as if saying it could serve as a kind of protection. But the peak carried within it the seed of something that Starr may not have fully reckoned with, something that no amount of clarity about plants and people could have prevented once the structural logic took hold. Thomasville had become, by the 1990s, not only a manufacturer but a brand system. The galleries, the advertising campaigns, the lifestyle marketing, the retail infrastructure, the 500-plus dedicated sales environments. These were the assets that drove growth, that generated consumer loyalty, and that made Thomasville a name worth owning even apart from the factories that had created it. And there was the fracture line, invisible at the peak but running deep beneath everything. The brand had grown so strong that it could be separated from the production. The name could travel. The name could be attached to products sourced from other countries, built by other hands, made from other materials. The name could be bought, sold, and licensed by people who had never set foot in a finishing room or stood in a kiln shed in the Carolina heat, breathing the sweet dry warmth of oak drying in stacks. Once the brand became more valuable than the production system, once the label on the drawer mattered more to the consumer than the factory that built the drawer, a separation became possible that the founders could never have imagined. Starr knew you couldn't get the plants and the people back once you lost them. What the logic of the brand system was already proving, quietly, in boardrooms and quarterly reports and acquisition prospectuses, was that someone might eventually decide they didn't need the plants or the people at all, that the name alone was the asset worth keeping, that everything else, the sawdust, the varnish, the 7,000 workers, the morning shift, the town, was cost. That was the summit, the highest point. And the people inside those walls, the workers, the designers, the finishers, the line supervisors, the maintenance crews who kept the conveyors running and the kilns burning, had no reason to believe the ground beneath them was about to shift. The forces that would dismantle Thomasville didn't arrive all at once. They gathered slowly across an ocean, through trade agreements and shipping containers and price lists that made the math of domestic furniture production harder to justify with every passing quarter. For a company built on the premise that Piedmont timber and Piedmont hands produced something worth paying more for, the math was existential. In 1994, China's wood furniture exports to the United States totaled $241 million. 10 years later, in 2004, that number had reached $4.2 billion, a 17-fold increase in a single decade. The scale of the shift was so large and so fast that the American furniture industry barely had time to understand what was happening before it had already happened. Before the container ships had docked, the warehouse floors had filled, and the price tags on the showroom displays had dropped to levels that no domestic manufacturer, no matter how efficient, could match. The opening came through policy. The U.S.-China bilateral WTO agreement in 1999 lowered trade barriers and eased China's path into the World Trade Organization. The agreement was framed as a step toward global economic integration, reasonable language for a reasonable sounding idea, supported by both political parties, endorsed by economists, promoted as progress. What it meant for furniture towns in North Carolina was that the cost advantage of Chinese manufacturing, already significant, was now backed by the full machinery of international trade law. Tariffs that had offered some protection fell or were circumvented. Container ships that had carried modest volumes began carrying floods. The playing field that trade negotiators described as level was, from the perspective of a woodworker in Thomasville earning a middle-class wage, tilted so steeply that nothing could stay upright on it. The Richmond Federal Reserve would later document the damage with clinical precision. North Carolina furniture manufacturing lost more than half its jobs between 1999 and 2009, with the Fed identifying lower-cost Asian imports, mostly from China, as the central force behind the collapse. By 2016, 73.5% of all furniture sold in America was imported. The domestic industry that had defined towns like Thomasville, High Point, Lenoir, and Morganton, towns where the factory wasn't just the largest employer but the organizing principle of civic life, hadn't just contracted, it had been replaced. But the competition wasn't entirely imposed from outside, and the narrative of foreign invasion, satisfying as it might be, doesn't survive contact with the full record. The Richmond Fed noted a detail that complicates the story considerably. American furniture executives themselves had initially encouraged the Asian sourcing shift. They'd seen the price differential, a Chinese furniture worker earning in a day what a North Carolina worker earned in an hour. They'd toured the factories in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces, walked the production lines, inspected the output, and concluded that offshore sourcing wasn't a threat to be resisted, but an opportunity to be managed. The imports weren't sneaking in through the back door. The front door was being held open by the same people who ran the domestic plants. Tom Tilley, Thomasville's president and CEO in the early 2000s, faced a version of that math every quarter. The competition wasn't abstract. It was specific and relentless. A Chinese factory could produce a bedroom set that retailed for less than Thomasville's combined cost of materials, labor, overhead, and shipping. The quality gap that had once protected American makers was narrowing every year. Chinese manufacturers were learning fast, investing in new equipment, hiring Western-trained designers, improving their finish work and joinery at a pace that surprised even the skeptics who dismissed the early imports as junk that no serious consumer would buy. Inside Furniture Brands International, the conglomerate that by then owned Thomasville, the response was to join the wave rather than fight it. The company's SEC filings described a strategy built for the new reality, designing and engineering products domestically, while sourcing manufacturing from independent offshore producers in China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. The language in those filings was bloodless, the kind of prose that SEC attorneys draft and accountants approve. Imported product and offshore capabilities and competitive pricing. But translated into North Carolina geography, each of those phrases meant the same thing. The work was leaving. The skill that generations of Thomasville workers had built, the knowledge of wood, the instinct for joinery, the practiced eye for finish quality, was being replaced by a purchase order sent to a factory 6,000 miles away. The concentration risk was already visible in the numbers. By 2006, just two foreign manufacturers accounted for 21% and 19% of Thomasville's imported product. 40% of the imports flowing through a brand built by 7,000 American workers were coming from two factories on the other side of the Pacific. The company's fate was tied to producers it didn't own, in countries it didn't control, through supply chains that could be disrupted by a dock strike, a trade dispute, or a quality failure that Thomasville's own finishing rooms would never have allowed out the door. Nancy W. Webster was appointed Thomasville's president and CEO in 2005 inheriting a company already deep into its offshore transformation. Webster would later describe the competitive reality publicly and without euphemism. Offshore resources had advanced to the point where it was extremely difficult to compete with domestically produced product, and consumers needed desired designs at affordable, competitive prices that domestic manufacturing struggled to deliver. She wasn't wrong about the economics. The economics were brutal, verifiable, and getting worse with every quarterly report. But the economics were only half the story. The other half was playing out in the parking lots and break rooms and living rooms of Thomasville, North Carolina, where workers who'd spent their careers building furniture by hand were beginning to understand that the math had turned against them, and that the people making the decisions had already accepted the answer before the question was asked. In 2004, the Department of Commerce had imposed anti-dumping duties on wooden bedroom furniture from China, acknowledging that Chinese imports were being sold below fair market value. The case covered products made not only from solid wood, but also from engineered wood products, plywood, particle board, and medium-density fiberboard. The trade case acknowledged what the showroom floor already showed. The imports weren't just cheaper versions of American furniture. They were a fundamentally different category of product, built from different materials at different cost structures, flowing into the same retail channels, where Thomasville had spent decades building its prestige. The Department of Labor would later certify workers at Thomasville's Plant M for trade adjustment assistance, a federal program that exists because the government officially recognizes when American jobs are lost, specifically because production shifted abroad or imports increased. The certification was a bureaucratic acknowledgement, stamped and filed, and entered into a federal database, that the work had moved to other countries and the workers had been left behind. It didn't bring the work back. It confirmed what the empty parking lots already said. The decisions that sealed Thomasville's fate didn't come from a single villain in a single boardroom on a single afternoon. They came in sequence, each one building on the last, each one made by people who believed, or said they believed, that they were doing what the competitive situation required. The tragedy is not that the logic was flawed. The tragedy is that the logic was sound at every individual step, and the catastrophe emerged from the accumulation of reasonable choices that together amounted to the dismantling of everything a town had built across a century. The first critical decision came in 1995, when Armstrong World Industries sold Thomasville to Furniture Brands International for roughly $335 million. Armstrong had owned Thomasville since the late 1960s, and the sale wasn't hostile or predatory, it was strategic. Armstrong was refocusing its portfolio, and Furniture Brands was assembling what it intended to be the largest residential furniture company in America. Furniture Brands already owned Broyhill and Lane. Adding Thomasville gave them a prestige brand to sit atop a portfolio that covered every price point and every room in the American home. The theory was scale, combined purchasing power, shared distribution networks, a national furniture portfolio that could dominate showrooms from coast to coast. The theory made sense on paper and in presentation decks and in the trade press that covered the deal. What it meant for Thomasville, translated from corporate strategy into human geography, was that the company's fate, its plant decisions, its sourcing strategy, its capital allocation, its labor force, was no longer governed from the town that bore its name. It was governed from a corporate headquarters whose obligation was to optimize a portfolio of brands, not to protect any single community. The distinction between those two objectives was invisible at the time of the sale. It would become the whole story. For the workers in Thomasville, the acquisition changed nothing at first. The plants still ran, the shifts still filled, the paychecks still came. The work was still there every morning, the same hands shaped the same wood, the same finishing rooms smelled the same way, the same trucks pulled out of the same loading docks. If you worked on the factory floor in 1996, the year after the sale, the only difference you might have noticed was the name on certain corporate communications. What changed was invisible and structural. The decision-making authority had migrated from people who could see the factory floor from their office windows to people who saw the factory floor as a line item on a consolidated balance sheet. Thomasville was no longer the whole story for the people who controlled its future. It was one brand among several, one set of plants among many, one workforce competing for capital allocation against other workforces in other towns that happened to be owned by the same parent company. And the balance sheet, increasingly, was telling a story that the factory floor couldn't answer. A story about margins, about import pricing, about the gap between what it cost to make furniture in North Carolina and what it cost to buy it from the other side of the world. The second decision unfolded gradually across the 1980s and 1990s, and it was the one that made everything else possible. Thomasville and its parent company invested heavily in the brand apparatus, the 500 galleries, the $10 million television campaigns, the lifestyle marketing, the retail infrastructure that Frederick Starr had built with such skill and care. The investment worked brilliantly. The brand became one of the most recognized names in American furniture, synonymous with quality and aspiration, and the kind of home that a certain American woman, educated, taste-conscious, willing to pay for permanence, wanted to build. But as the brand's power grew, it subtly detached from its origin. The galleries and the advertising and the consumer loyalty became, in the eyes of corporate planners, the company's primary asset, more valuable than any single factory, more durable than any particular workforce, more portable than any physical plant rooted in Carolina soil. The factories were necessary components of the system. The brand was the system itself. And once that hierarchy was established in the corporate mind, the factories became negotiable in ways they'd never been before. The work could be moved and the brand would follow, or so the spreadsheet suggested. The question of whether a brand built on domestic craftsmanship could survive the removal of the domestic craftsmanship was not one the spreadsheets were designed to answer. The third decision broke the surface publicly and violently. On June 7, 2005, Furniture Brands announced the closure of Plant A, a 373,000 square foot high-end case goods facility in Thomasville, North Carolina, along with 436,600 square feet of support facilities. More than 600 salaried and hourly jobs would be eliminated. It was the largest single layoff in the company's history. Some products would shift to other Thomasville facilities. The rest would be replaced by imports. W.G. Mickey Holloman, chairman and CEO of Furniture Brands, framed the closure in the language that corporate executives use when the audience is shareholders and the subject is the destruction of livelihoods. The closures were an accelerated step to balance domestic production with the import program, improve capacity utilization, absorb fixed costs, improve margins, and deliver value to shareholders and consumers. Every word chosen for its neutrality. Every phrase designed to make the elimination of 600 families' income sound like a mechanical adjustment, a system calibration, a step toward efficiency, a rational response to market conditions. But Plant A wasn't a peripheral facility on the edge of the company's operations. It was a high-end case goods plant in Thomasville itself, the kind of operation where skilled workers built the furniture that justified the brand's premium pricing. The furniture that customers chose specifically because the name Thomasville meant something about how it was made and where it came from. Closing it didn't just remove capacity from a production chart, it severed the connection between the name on the drawer and the place where the drawer was built. AP photographers captured workers leaving Plant A at the end of their shift on June 8th, the day after the announcement, filing out through the factory gates in their work clothes, carrying nothing but what they'd brought in that morning, walking away from a building that had just been told its future was over. Those images carried something that no corporate restructuring announcement could contain or explain away. The fourth decision followed within a year. In 2006, Thomasville announced the closure of Plant D, a 309,000 square foot case goods facility. 278 more jobs eliminated, production ending by August 1st. Nancy Webster, now in the president's chair, explained the rationale without ambiguity. Offshore resources had advanced to the point that it was extremely difficult to compete with domestically produced product, while consumers needed desired designs at affordable, competitive prices. Rick Millen, Vice President of Human Resources, handled the operational details of the shutdown. The Plant D closure was the 9th layoff at Thomasville since March 2001, the 9th in 5 years. By May 2006, the company had eliminated at least 3,137 jobs, almost half the peak workforce of 7,000, across those 9 separate rounds of cuts. Each layoff was announced with the same corporate language of competitive necessity and strategic realignment. Each one landed in the town with a recognition that had grown familiar but never less painful. Another piece of the foundation pulled away, another round of families facing the question of what comes next. Webster's explanation, that offshore production had become too competitive to match domestically, was accurate as far as it went. But it was also incomplete in a way that mattered deeply. The offshore production hadn't arrived like weather, impersonal and beyond human choice. It had been cultivated, invested in, and expanded by the same corporate system that was now citing it as the reason for closing domestic plants. Furniture brands had designed products specifically to be manufactured by independent offshore producers. It had built the supply chains. It had shifted the sourcing percentages quarter by quarter, year by year, deliberately and with full knowledge of where the trend was heading. And now it was closing the American factories because the offshore alternative that it had constructed was cheaper than the domestic production it had allowed to become uncompetitive through underinvestment. The logic was circular, and the circle was closing around Thomasville. The fifth and final decision came years later, but it completed the arc with the finality of a period at the end of a long, grim sentence. On September 9, 2013, Furniture Brands International filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Ralph Scozzafava, the company's chairman and CEO, described the filing publicly as the best path to a long-term solution for liquidity challenges, and as a way to continue serving customers during the restructuring. The SEC filing described up to $140 million in debtor-in-possession financing from Oaktree Capital Management and a proposed asset purchase offer of $166 million from the same firm. Later, KPS Capital Partners emerged as the winning bidder, acquiring the company's assets for $280 million. The bankruptcy paperwork told the corporate story. Assets, liabilities, creditors, DIP financing, stalking horse bids. The pension file told the human one. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that steps in when companies fail to keep the retirement promises they made to their workers, assumed responsibility for the benefits of more than 19,000 current and future Furniture Brands retirees. The pension plan was approximately 55% funded, carrying $337 million in assets against $609 million in projected benefits. The gap, $272 million, represented decades of promises made to workers who had traded the best years of their working lives for a guarantee that the company would take care of them after the work was done. The PBGC would cover what the law allowed, up to its statutory maximums. For many retirees, particularly those with longer service and higher earned benefits, the PBGC maximum was less than what they'd been promised. The collapse had moved from factory gates to retirement mailboxes. Work that had been sold as a career, as a covenant between company and worker, had become a federal pension file and a check that fell short. In 1990, Frederick Starr had said it plainly, "Great plants, great people. You can't get them back if you close them." 15 years later, Furniture Brands closed Plant A using the language of margin improvement and capacity utilization and shareholder value delivery. The warning had been spoken at the summit in a national newspaper by the man who understood the enterprise best. The warning was correct. It was ignored. And by the time anyone looked back at it, the plants were already closed and the people were already gone. The collapse didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived as a count. March 2001, the first layoff, then another, then another, then another. By May 2006, at least 3,137 jobs had been eliminated across 9 separate rounds of cuts in 5 years. June 2005, Plant A closed. 373,000 square feet of high-end case goods. More than 600 workers told the factory was finished. The largest single layoff in the company's history. May 2006, Plant D closed. 309,000 square feet. 278 more jobs. The 9th round of cuts. Production to end by August. Later that year, local news reported what the layoff numbers had been approaching for some time. Thomasville Furniture had ceased manufacturing in Thomasville, North Carolina. The remaining workers at Plant C were assembling furniture from parts purchased overseas, not building it, not selecting the wood, not running it through the kilns or the shapers or the finishing rooms that had defined the company's quality for nearly a century. Assembling, unpacking imported components and fastening them together. The craft was gone. What remained was logistics wearing the uniform of manufacturing. The workers who walked out of Plant A on June 8, 2005, the day after the closure announcement, carried nothing that showed on camera. No boxes of personal effects, no mementos from the shop floor. They carried what they always carried: lunch pails, thermoses, the muscle memory of a shift's work still in their hands. They walked to their cars in the parking lot. They drove home on the same roads they'd driven every working day. Some of them had been making that drive for 20 years, some for 30. The morning shift that didn't come in, not the next week, not the week after, left behind a factory floor built for the sound of work, saws that stood still, planers that didn't run, conveyor belts motionless on their tracks, finishing rooms where the humidity wasn't regulated anymore because there was nothing left to finish and nobody left to finish it. Break rooms where the coffee machine went cold and the shift schedule on the wall showed names that no longer had anywhere to report. Somebody's jacket still hung on a hook. A lunch cooler sat under a bench. Small things that nobody came back for, because coming back for a jacket meant walking through a factory that had stopped being yours. The air changed. That was the thing nobody expected. A furniture factory has a particular atmosphere: sawdust, varnish, machine oil, the dry sweetness of kiln-dried hardwood. When the machines stop and the wood stops moving and the finishing rooms go dark, that atmosphere dissipates. What replaces it is the smell of concrete and dust and stillness, the smell of a building that has lost its reason for existing. Kelly Craver, Thomasville's city manager, described the closure as another manufacturing domino falling. She acknowledged what everyone in the town already understood. This wasn't a surprise, and it wasn't the first blow. It was the latest in a sequence that had been landing for years, each one weakening the industrial base that held the town's economy upright. The burden fell heaviest on furniture families, Craver said. The households where the Thomasville paycheck wasn't just income, but identity, where the work wasn't just employment, but the thing that connected you to the town, and the town to itself, and the past to the present. For those families, the question wasn't abstract. It was immediate and concrete. Where do you go when the skill you've spent your working life building, the ability to select wood by grain and color, to shape a joint by feel, to read a finish coat by sight, has no buyer within driving distance? Steve Googe, executive director of the Davidson County Economic Development Commission, spoke about the future with the careful language that the job required. The county needed to re-engineer toward high-tech manufacturing, he said. Motorsports components, laminate flooring, windows and doors, plastics, the vocabulary of reinvention, of resilience, of communities that adapt and persist and find new reasons to exist. But Googe also said what the optimistic language couldn't cover. Nobody wanted to take over and upfit an old furniture plant. The buildings were designed for a specific kind of work, the movement of raw lumber through a sequence of stations that turned it into finished product. They had loading docks sized for timber trucks. They had dust collection systems built for sawdust. They had electrical panels wired for planers and conveyors. Without the work they were built for, they were just structures. Large, expensive, purpose-built for a purpose that had left. Davidson County had lost more than 4,100 furniture jobs between January 2000 and March 2006. The county gained employment in other sectors during the same period, but the gains didn't match the losses. The new jobs paid differently, required different skills, offered different trajectories. A case goods finisher with 20 years of experience didn't become a plastics technician overnight. A kiln operator didn't retrain as a laminate flooring specialist between layoff notices. A man who'd spent his career judging cherry grain by sight and walnut finish by touch didn't have a transferable skill in the way that economists use the term. His skill was profound, specific, and rooted in an industry that was vanishing beneath his feet. The transition was, for each worker and each family, a private reckoning, with a future that looked nothing like the past they'd been promised. Some workers found new jobs in the industries that were growing in the region. Some commuted to factories in other towns. Some retired early, if they could afford to, and waited for the pension checks that might or might not arrive at the amounts they'd been told. Some left Thomasville entirely, pulled their children out of local schools, sold houses that had lost value along with the paychecks that had paid for them, and moved to wherever the next job pointed. The departure was quiet. One family at a time, one moving truck at a time, one for sale sign at a time, on a street where the neighbors had all worked at the same plant. Nancy Webster, in October 2005, provided the number that told the story most starkly: 25%. That was the share of wooden furniture sold under the Thomasville name that was still made in America. 3/4 of the product carrying the name built by T.J. Finch, elevated by Austin Finch, protected by Frederick Starr, was now manufactured somewhere else entirely. The upholstery held longer, 85% domestic for fabric-covered furniture. But the case goods, the dressers, the dining tables, the bedroom sets, the pieces that had defined Thomasville's reputation, those had largely left the country. The name remained. The hands that had given the name its meaning did not. Then the bankruptcy arrived. September 9th, 2013. Furniture Brands International filed Chapter 11. KPS Capital Partners acquired the assets for $280 million, formed Heritage Home Group. In 2014, Heritage Home Group closed the remaining Thomasville operations in Thomasville, North Carolina. 84 jobs. The last ones, 84, not 7,000, not 3,000, not 600, 84. A number so small it barely registered as a layoff in industry terms, but it was the last number, the final subtraction, which made it, in its own way, the heaviest of all, not because of the jobs it removed, but because of what it confirmed. The century-long connection between the name Thomasville and the town of Thomasville was over. The final thread between the name and the place it came from, cut with a press release and an effective date. The big chair still stood downtown on Main Street. The factory whistle had stopped years earlier. The parking lots were empty or cracked over with weeds. The finishing rooms were dark. The kilns were cold. The town was still there. The people were still there. The houses still stood on the streets that furniture paychecks had paid for. The churches still held services that furniture workers had attended every Sunday after Saturday overtime. But the work was gone, the daily act of shaping wood into something lasting. The reason the big chair existed, the reason the town was called Chair City, that had ended. And the silence that replaced it was the kind of silence that settles into a place built for noise and stays. The strongest evidence of what the collapse meant to the people who'd lived inside Thomasville Furniture didn't appear in SEC filings or press releases or trade journal analyses. It appeared in a room full of boxes. In 2013, as Furniture Brands entered bankruptcy, a group of Thomasville retirees gathered to sort through what remained of the company's institutional memory. Dave Ogren, Ryan Tessaw, John Sullivan, Vicky Holder, and others, people who had given years or decades to the company, arrived as volunteers to catalog what a century of furniture making had produced beyond furniture. Decades of product catalogs, employee picnic photographs, fading at the edges, holiday party programs, company newsletters with headlines about production milestones and retirement dinners and annual United Way drives, civic materials documenting the interlocking life of a manufacturer and its town over the course of 100 years. The materials had been stored without much care or order, and with the company in bankruptcy, the real possibility existed that the entire collection would end up in a dumpster. 100 years of institutional memory hauled off as waste. Nobody was paying the retirees to do this work. Nobody had assigned them the task. They came because they understood, with the particular clarity that belongs to people who were inside the thing that's disappearing, that if they didn't save the memory would vanish as completely and as permanently as the jobs already had. Ogren, who had spent 13 years at Thomasville as a marketing executive before moving on to other work in 1982, described what it felt like to see the "for sale" sign on the company's headquarters building on East Main Street. It brought a tear to his eye, he said, not because a commercial building was for sale, buildings change hands all the time, but because of what the sign represented. The 5-story, 225,000 square foot headquarters and showroom where room after room of Thomasville Furniture had been staged to show American customers what their lives could look like. That building was no longer needed by the company whose name was still, technically, on it. The pension story reached its conclusion through federal channels and form letters that arrived in retirees' mailboxes. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation assumed responsibility for the retirement benefits of more than 19,000 current and future furniture brands retirees. The plan had been approximately 55% funded, $337 million in assets against $609 million in obligations. The PBGC would cover what the law allowed. For workers who had earned modest pensions over shorter careers, the federal payments might come close to what they'd been promised. For workers who had spent decades on the factory floor and earned benefits at the higher end, the workers who'd given the most years and trusted the promise most completely, the PBGC maximum was less, sometimes substantially less, than what the company had told them they'd earned. The gap between the promise and the payment was quiet, private, and repeated 19,000 times in 19,000 households. The physical town adapted because towns do, because the alternative to adaptation is disappearance, and Thomasville was not going to disappear. Economic development officials pursued the industries that Steve Googe had named: motorsports components, laminate flooring, windows and doors, plastics, high-tech manufacturing. Some of those industries arrived. New employers set up operations in spaces that the furniture economy had left behind. The tax base shifted. The unemployment numbers stabilized, then improved. The town was not dying. It was becoming something else, something that no one had chosen, no one had planned for, but that was taking shape anyway from the necessities of a community that still had people, and still had mortgages, and still had children who needed schools and futures. Heritage Home Group, the entity that KPS Capital Partners had formed from the furniture brand's bankruptcy assets, itself filed for bankruptcy with approximately $280 million in outstanding debt. The cycle of acquisition, debt, restructuring, and failure turned one more time, producing one more set of legal filings, one more round of ownership transfers, one more layer of distance between the brand names and the workers and the towns that had created the value carried by those names. In 2018, Authentic Brands Group completed the purchase of the Thomasville, Henriton, and Drexel brand names from Heritage Home Group. Authentic Brands Group is an intellectual property management company headquartered in New York. It owns and manages brand names across multiple consumer categories. It does not operate furniture factories. It does not employ woodworkers. It does not run finishing rooms or kiln sheds or environmental simulation testing laboratories. It licenses names to manufacturers who produce products that carry those names, and it collects fees for the use of brand equity that someone else, somewhere else, a long time ago, built with their hands and their knowledge of wood and their belief that the name on the product meant something about how it was made. The name Thomasville, the name that T.J. Finch had attached to a chair company because it was the name of the town where the wood was cut and the chairs were built, belonged now to a brand management firm in Manhattan. The name could be put on anything. It could be placed on furniture made in any country, from any material, by any manufacturer willing to pay the licensing fee. The name traveled freely across oceans and supply chains and retail channels. The town stayed where it was. The workers stayed where they were. The big chair stayed on Main Street. A chair made in Thomasville, North Carolina, in 1955 or 1970 or 1985 is still, in many American homes, the chair that sits at the head of the dining table, still solid, still holding weight, still showing the grain of the oak or the cherry or the walnut that a worker selected and shaped and finished by hand in a factory that no longer runs. The wood has darkened with the decades, the way real wood does, slowly, gracefully, taking on the particular warmth that only time and use and the oils of human hands can give it. The joints are tight. The drawers still slide on their tracks without catching. Run your hand along the seat and you can feel the finish, smooth and deliberate, applied by someone who knew what good felt like beneath their fingers and who would not let a piece leave the line until it met that standard. That chair will outlast the company that made it. It already has. Thomasville's tragedy is not that a brand disappeared. Brands disappear every year, and most of them are mourned only by their creditors and their marketing departments. The tragedy is that the brand survived in a form that no longer needed the town, the workers, the kilns, the finishing rooms, the environmental testing laboratory, the five-story showroom, the morning shift filing in through the gates, or the manufacturing culture that gave the name its meaning in the first place. The name lived on. The work did not. And the distance between the name and the work, between what the label promises and what the label no longer represents, is the full measure of what was lost. The Finch family entered the furniture business to protect a $2,000 lumber debt. They stayed because they discovered what the town could build when the timber was good and the workers were skilled and the railroad could carry the product to every corner of the country. They built a company that employed 7,000 people, that filled 500 galleries across America with the evidence of what Piedmont hands and Piedmont timber could produce, that earned a reputation so strong it became, in the end, the only part of the enterprise anyone wanted to keep. The decisions that dismantled the production came one at a time, each measured in square feet closed and workers released and imported product percentages adjusted upward on a sourcing chart. Each one was explained in the language of competitive necessity, capacity utilization, margin improvement. Each one was, on its own terms, defensible. Together, they amounted to the quiet replacement of a manufacturing culture with a licensing arrangement, the exchange of a living enterprise for a line of intellectual property managed from a city that has never smelled sawdust or lacquer or the sweet dry heat of a kiln full of hardwood. The big chair still stands on Main Street in Thomasville, North Carolina, too large to sit in, too symbolic to remove. Built in 1922 from enough wood to make 100 ordinary chairs, standing now in a town where the ordinary chairs are no longer made. It doesn't explain what happened. It doesn't assign blame or draw conclusions or deliver lessons. It stands where the work used to be, in the silence where the factory noise used to carry, and it remains. The last piece of Thomasville furniture that Thomasville still owns.